Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being with us. I'm Gene Block, UCLA's Chancellor, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of the Possible World series. One of the great things that UCLA does is to act as a convener, bringing our experts and innovators together with their counterparts from beyond campus to think through the major issues of our time. To that end, UCLA's Division of Humanities has partnered with the Berggruen Institute on this series, which is designed to gather some of today's most imaginative thinkers and creators to deliver talks on the future of humanity. Well, that's an ambitious goal, of course, and I'm grateful that in the Berggruen Institute, we have a partner that's equal to the challenge. Our discussions on the future of humanity begin today with a look at our own politically fractured nation. We are pleased to welcome Harvard professor and political theorist Danielle Allen, whose timely lecture will address the events that have dominated our political discourse and unsettled our spirits for the past 6 weeks, the terrifying attack on the United States Capitol building on January 6th. Certainly, the US is no stranger to political violence or domestic terrorism, but not since the British burned down the White House and the Capitol during the War of 1812 have we seen a spectacle quite like we witnessed in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Understanding the meaning and implications of that event is essential for understanding where we are and where we're going as a nation. We are fortunate to have a thinker of Professor Allen's stature to help us search for just that understanding. This event would not have been possible without the support and far-reaching vision of the Berggruen Institute, an organization dedicated to sharing insight about the transformations shaping our lives and societies, and we're grateful to Nicholas Berggruen and his entire institute for their part in developing this important program. To help launch this series, I'll now turn the program over to Berggruen Institute's Vice President for Programs, Dr. Nils Gilman. Dr. Gilman leads the Institute's research program, directs the resident fellowship program, and is also deputy editor of a newly launched Noema magazine. He has strong ties with UC, having studied at UC Berkeley and more recently serving as the campus's associate chancellor. Thank you for being with us, Nils. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chancellor Block. Hello, everyone. I'm Nils Gilman, Vice President at the Berggruen Institute, where we work to develop foundational ideas for reshaping political and social institutions in this time of great transformations. I want to welcome you all today to this first lecture of the Possible World series, which we're just starting now with UCLA. This lecture series is designed to expose and explore new ideas from today's most imaginative intellectual leaders and creators. By now, it's perhaps obvious that the eruption of the COVID-19 pandemic on the one hand, and recent political, social, and economic upheavals on the other, are not separate episodes in history, but rather interdependent, planetary-scale phenomena. The pandemic has exposed the corrosive economic and racial inequality eating away at societies around the world. It's also laid bare an all too common absence of competent governance, which in many places has been less an accident than a deliberate program, advanced politically by those who would like to increase division. What the pandemic has also exposed is that it's not just the virus, but the ideas about it that matter, which underscores a key lesson of history, that change happens through ideas. And so the question we pose to all our possible world thinkers is this: on what basis of ideas can we build a better world? What sorts of new ideas can help us reimagine the world anew? Partnering with UCLA, we aim to give a platform to true visionaries whose work has only just begun to shape the physical and intellectual landscape of society. Tonight, we have the great honor of hearing from Danielle Allen on polarization and the path forward after January 6th. As a MacArthur Award winner, university professor at Harvard University, and director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, Danielle Allen has been published broadly in classics, democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. But Danielle is more than just a scholar. What really makes her stand out is her fearlessness in taking on the necessary and toughest questions facing democratic society. From her research with the Democratic Knowledge Project to her award-winning book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. This aspect of her thinking is what we're excited to bring to light in our Possible World series tonight. We believe Danielle's ideas will help to rethink and renew our democracy to meet this century's challenges and the ongoing transformations of how we live, interact, and are governed. And now let me hand it over to our partner in all of this, Dean of the Humanities at UCLA, David Schauberg. Thank you.
Thank you, Nils. The opportunity to join with the Berggruen Institute in hosting the Possible Worlds lecture series is truly welcome to us at UCLA and in the Division of Humanities, because we share with the thinkers and leaders at the Berggruen Institute the conviction that ideas, including the ideas transmitted and debated in various disciplines of the humanities, are what guide the continual making and remaking of our world, even in the most practical applications of policy. We're committed to the belief that the critical, questioning, and creative drive of humanistic scholarship can and must help us to recognize and redress injustices in our world and to push for greater mutual understanding and well-being. As a way of opening this series, we're most fortunate to have Professor Danielle Allen, who in her writings has brought the deepest insights from philosophy and political theory to bear on crucial questions of political participation, education, and incarceration in our country, and who has in this way brought the resources of the academy and associated institutions into new and direct relevance for public thought about the shared American future. As James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University and Director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, Professor Allen has pursued her research in numerous articles and 3 widely read books: Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A., Education and Equality, and Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, which was awarded the Heartland Prize, the Sokolow Book Prize, and the Society of American Historians Francis Parkman Prize. As director of the Safra Center, Professor Allen led a collaboration of scientists and researchers at leading institutions, including the Harvard Global Health Institute, Rockefeller Foundation, COVID Act Now, COVID Local, CIDRAP, and many others, to develop the key metrics for COVID suppression framework, which provides clear, accessible guidance to policymakers and the public on how to target and suppress COVID-19 more effectively across the nation. She's also the principal investigator for the Democratic Knowledge Project, a distributed research and action lab at Harvard University, which seeks to identify, strengthen, and disseminate the bodies of knowledge, skills, and capacities that democratic citizens need in order to succeed in operating our democracy. Professor Allen is chair of the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, past chair of the Pulitzer Prize and Mellon Foundation boards, a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. Finally, she's the recipient of the 2020 John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, an award administered by the Library of Congress and recognizing work in disciplines that are not covered by the Nobel Prizes. In the many positions she's held, in the many honors she's received, Professor Allen is pushing humanistic scholars and scholarship to places where they can help to solve the problems that our world faces and help us to reach new understanding. Directly following Professor Allen's remarks, we'll welcome UCLA professor Lynn Vavreck to moderate an interview with Professor Allen. Professor Vavreck is the Marvin Hoffenberg Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA. She's a contributing columnist to The Upshot at the New York Times and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's a recipient of the Andrew F. Carnegie Prize in the Humanities and Social Sciences and the author of 5 books, including Identity Crisis, the 2016 Presidential Campaign, and The Battle for the Meaning of America. Her 2020 election project, Nationscape, is the largest study of presidential elections ever fielded in the United States. During this portion of the program, we'll look forward to taking questions from the audience. You can submit these through the Q&A feature. Now, let's welcome Professor Danielle Allen.
Thank you so much, Dean Schauberg. Thank you, Dr. Gilman, Chancellor Block. You failed to mention my most important distinction, which is that I'm from Southern California. So it's such a pleasure to be with all of you. And in this time where we're all so distant from one another, I have to say thank you because my mom is in the audience. So hi, Mom. I feel at home to be with you, community at UCLA. I'm so honored by this opportunity and just thrilled to have the chance to talk with you. Thank you for those generous words of introduction. Truly, very, very kind of you. We have lived through just an extraordinary year, a year for the ages. The pandemic, efforts to undo the ill effects of police violence and racial domination, the Capitol insurrection, just one in some sense of a long list of challenges and difficulties we've faced. We're still very much processing what we've all been living through. And my hope tonight is just to help us all take a step back and try to look at the big picture, so we have a sense both of what happened and where we might go. Can we chart a path forward? Can we find a way to give ourselves a sense of agency and renewal, hope for our ability to recover what does look like a pretty broken democracy? When we think about that insurrection in the Capitol, that remarkable moment that so many people in this country, I think, really watched and saw in that occasion a break, a fundamental rupture in our democracy, we weren't actually seeing something that was breaking for the first time. So that's the first point I want to spend time on with you. Our democracy has been broken. It's been broken for a while. And as we watched that wildfire light, we were watching really a blaze set to dry tinder. The signs of the difficulty of the breakage have been with us for a spell. For me, the first flashing red alert alarm bell or light came in 2013, when Congress had an approval rating of 9%. Now, I'm a student of democratic theory. I study the early modern design of constitutional democracy. And one of the first principles and arguments of the theorists from that period was that the legislature is the first branch of government. It's not the executive, it's the legislature. The reason we think of the legislature as the first branch is because it has a job of articulating the voice of the people. So if the people approves of its own voice at a rate of 9%, you know your democracy is broken. That was for me really the moment where I started working on the question of our democracy, its breakage and what we could do about it. But this year too, the signs have been abundant. When we look at the coronavirus crisis, we can look around the world and make comparisons and have to face the fact that the US did less well than other countries. There's a very valuable study by Sheila Jasnoff, my colleague here at Harvard, and others, a big network of scholars anchored at Cornell, that produced a comparison of performance around the globe and made the argument that there are sort of three categories of response to COVID. Countries that fall in a control category of response, countries that fall in a consensus category, and countries that fall in a chaos category. Control countries include places like China, Singapore, South Korea, where a strong centralization, strong health authorities manage the situation aggressively and quickly. Consensus countries include places like Germany and Australia and New Zealand, constitutional democracies, federal democracies with sturdy roots of solidarity and effective governance, able to cut through polarization. Australia set up a sort of wartime style cabinet drawing on membership from both parties from all across the country in order to move the work of response forward. Then you have the chaos countries, us, India, Brazil, big, massively scaled, multicultural democracies, often facing robust populist politics. There, an absence of effective decision-making, an absence of effective communication, polarization, tangling both decision-making and communications. And in that problematic space of chaos response, we saw an absence of effective governance in this country. There's a known playbook for responding to COVID and we weren't able to execute on it. So that failure of governance in response to COVID is another key signal of breakage in our democracy. But the sign for me, the greatest danger sign for our democracy is a data point about young people. And you may know this data point, it's gotten a lot of press, a lot of attention. 4 generations born before World War II, about 70% of those people, of that cohort, consider it essential to live in a democracy. For people who are 40 and under, barely 30% consider it essential to live in a democracy. This means that at some fundamental level, we are failing at a project of generational succession and transition. We are not handing down to those who are younger than ourselves a love of democracy or an understanding of it or a sense of its having value in their lives. Now, I say this not to critique young people. To the contrary, they actually have many good reasons for thinking that our democracy is broken and perhaps not worth their engagement. I remember the morning after the 2016 election, the Trump election, I was teaching a class, 9 a.m. class, Ancient and Medieval Political Philosophy. So I was more or less the first grown-up that my students were seeing after the results of the election came in. And of course, there was a lot of shock in the experience of that election result. And so I opened up space in my classroom for my students to just share their responses. I didn't invite anybody to stand up, but the first student who spoke did stand up. He rose and just in the most compelling and passionate way shouted at me, in effect, "You have abandoned us. Your generation has just abandoned us with this election result." What he was saying was that because of the existential threat of climate change, the election of Trump meant that the country was not going to take forward actions to change the direction of climate, and we had just lost the time we needed to fend off that existential threat. And he experienced that as a profound sense of abandonment. And that is indeed a part of what I think young people have experienced. They have clear visibility on problems confronting us, climate, issues of racial injustice, criminal justice system, and so forth. And they see a failure of our institutions of governance to respond. So their disaffection is motivated. It's not irrational. We can understand its sources. That experience of abandonment is connected to an experience of disempowerment. And that, I think, has broadly pervaded our society. That sense of disempowerment is also often a worry about elite capture. We watched that actually just unfold with the GameStop episode, where day traders wanted to take control of the market, and then it was hedge fund fellows at the top who got protection from regulators in that episode. So we're struggling with a situation where many feel disempowered and as if their institutions are not responsive to them. And in that broad context, that then gets entangled with a very complicated mix of cultural fights. So this fight that we have been having over, are we a multicultural democracy, or as some would have it, are we trying to sort of roll back the clock to maintain a situation of being a sort of majority white democracy? There are fights around gender and sexuality and religion and where that fits in the shape of our collective lives. So the issues of disempowerment are real, but they've also then gotten tangled up with this very complicated cultural conversation and cultural fight. And so we see across our country, there's communities of people who have experienced economic disempowerment, anxieties about climate and justice, but then also a sense of a lack of control over the shape of the life of their cultural community. So when we watched that insurrection at the Capitol, we saw Confederate flags, we saw the words and signs and symbols of white supremacy. That was there for sure. But that was an expression of those who saw dry tinder to take advantage of and wanted to light a spark. So while we saw an event, a revolution that had people espousing white supremacist ideologies at the head of it, the vanguard of it, so to speak, what they were really doing was lighting fire to dry tinder that's been with us for some time because of brokenness in our democracy. So it's really that brokenness in our democracy that I think we need to focus on in the first instance if we're going to be able to respond effectively to the situation in which we find ourselves. So I'd like to say a little bit more about that brokenness and how to understand it and what then some of our forward options might be. Here, I'm going to draw on the work of a wonderful theorist of digital media and theorist of our public life, Ethan Zuckerman. He runs a center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst for digital public infrastructure that supports democracy. And Ethan's recently published a book called Mistrust. It's an effort to explain how it is that we've built up such huge stores of mistrust in this country for our political institutions and for one another. Now, the interesting thing about Ethan's book is that he divides political participants into two categories. And he's been using these categories for years. So although his book just came out, he didn't create these categories in the wake of January 6th. His categories are that our politics can be divided between the institutionalists and the insurrectionists, all right? So as he sees it, if you think about a dynamic between institutionalists and insurrectionists, you can actually make a lot better sense of what's going on in our politics. Now, as an example of this, what Ethan means is if you think back to 2016, we all thought the 2016 election was going to be a contest between a left institutionalist, Hillary Clinton, and a right institutionalist, Jeb Bush. So by that description, you can see that I mean that an institutionalist is somebody who thinks the status quo is roughly speaking working, and what we need to do is basically tweak it, all right? But at the end of the day, the election wasn't really a contest between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, not fundamentally, not in its biggest substantive consequence. On the left, we had an insurrectionist in Bernie Sanders who said, the whole thing is broken. You know, we really got to rebuild from the roots to branch. On the right, we had another insurrectionist, Donald Trump. So across right and left, people have experienced disempowerment, and across right and left, a desire, an insurrectionist desire for dramatic change has arisen. And the institutionalist response to that has been uncertain and problematic. In effect, what the institutionalists are being asked to recognize is that the technocratic management of the economy and society over the last few decades has left a lot of people feeling both disempowered and that governance is ineffective in relationship to the clear needs they can see before them. Those needs, again, range from economic issues, issues of labor displacement, wage erosion, to the challenges around climate, the challenges around criminal justice. And again, those are the sort of fundamental issues where governance has gone wrong, and then they're getting mixed into a brew of cultural issues and concerns. Now, the surprising thing about this dynamic between the institutionalists and the insurrectionists is that it hasn't, as of yet, generated a productive vision for how to reform our politics, how to ensure that our institutions can both deliver effective governance and empower people. Instead, what we've gotten is a knockdown, drag out, bare knuckle fight between our two parties for control over those broken institutions. And to exhibit that point, I want to just tell the story of COVID response briefly to draw out a point about it that I think is not visible to most people. So I've said already that one of the painful things about COVID response in the US is that the playbook needed to suppress the disease was pretty clear from a pretty early point. From early March, it was already clear what Asian nations, what Australia, what New Zealand and so forth were doing. There was rapid moves to ramp up testing and contact tracing in those countries. There were also pretty robust controls of travel and borders internally, not just externally. Hard things to do, but even Australia managed to control movement internally through borders and so forth. And indeed, if we had succeeded at the same level, of Australia with regard to rate of mortality, we would have at this point something more like 15,000 people dead rather than the terrible numbers that we actually see. So there was technical knowledge already in the spring of how to approach COVID suppression. And that knowledge was available in this country. It was delivered to the White House by all kinds of public health professionals and policymakers. It was delivered to both houses of Congress, and Senate Republicans understood it, and indeed House Democrats understood it. In fact, House Democrats put the relevant kind of policy approach in the HEROES Act, which they passed in May. Yet the HEROES Act didn't move. It sat and sat and sat and sat. The Republicans were unwilling to move it forward. This was not, in fact, because the Republicans were against the specific policy for COVID response. What actually happened was that that HEROES Act had something else in it too. It had a big package of election security and integrity measures in it that the Democrats wanted in order to ensure that new approaches to voting, mail-in voting and so forth, could be done in the sturdiest and most robust and most secure fashion possible. Now, I am a huge supporter of the changes to the election rules that took place in the summer on account of the pandemic, the shift to mail-in voting, vote centers, et cetera. All of those things were incredibly important to ensure the continuity of our electoral system in a moment of pandemic crisis. So without any question, the introduction of those approaches to voting were good and right from my point of view, from my judgment about what democracy demands. However, those changes in the middle of an election time were experienced by people on the right as changes of the rules in the middle of an election. Now, why would they experience them this way when there's such a clear need in a pandemic to respond? Because of the bare knuckle calculus about votes. It was clear that for all that the policy was good and right, it would also bring electoral advantage to the Democrats and disadvantage to the Republicans. So again, although the policy was good and right, through a political lens, it was obviously advantageous to the Democrats and could therefore be read as, be interpreted as, be challenged as a pure power grab. So the Republicans had zero interest in supporting the package of electoral integrity and security measures in the HEROES Act put together by the Democrats. So hence the stalling from the Senate, from McConnell, for months. And you'll notice that the compromise around COVID response began to move forward at the end of September. Only then, and only then did it begin to move forward. And precisely because by that time, the rest of the package was moot. It was at that point too late to implement the investments in secretaries of state's office at a local level to support that election work. And you'll remember the big fight over the post office that month. That fight over the post office was sort of the tail end of what had been basically a Cold War about voting rights over the course of the whole summer. So in other words, this country just had one of the biggest fights over voting rights that we have had in our entire history, in the sense that this fight has cost us essentially 500,000 lives, okay? So we have to understand that and recognize that this fight over voting rights, whether or not we make voting as easy as possible or not, is the fundamental fight in our politics right now, okay? Now, as I narrate this, what I need to remind you again is that this fight over voting rights is happening against a backdrop of a world in which both sides, left and right, people have experienced disempowerment. The narratives of disempowerment are very different on both sides. So the Sanders insurrectionist has a narrative that the disempowerment flows from corporate greed and from the routine sort of predation of corporations and capital. The insurrectionists on the right have a narrative by which experience of disempowerment flow from, and you'll recognize the litany, liberal media, liberal universities, liberal technology companies, liberal global capital. So they have, the two categories of insurrectionists have different narrative about where disempowerment is flowing from. And the change of the electoral rules in the summer, in the middle of the pandemic, connected to a pre-existing narrative of disempowerment that has been circulating and active on the right for more than a decade at this point in time. That was the frame within which then the president could manufacture his lie repeatedly about electoral fraud over time and activate a population to insurrection. But the important point, again, is that there's dry tinder, and the dry tinder has been sitting there to be set on fire because of problems of disempowerment flowing from our failures of governance, from our institutionalists and their technocratic approach to politics. So yes, on the Capitol on July 6th, we did see white supremacy in action. But again, what I'm suggesting in this argument is that white supremacists saw dry tinder, lit a match. So it's a better way of understanding the entire moment of the insurrection is to focus more broadly on the experiences of disempowerment and alienation that characterize our population on both left and right. So then that leads us to the question of what to do about it. What can be done? And here I want to call your attention to, I want to invite you to a report that came out last June called Our Common Purpose. I was privileged to work on this report as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We ran a commission that worked for several years to think about the future of the practice of democracy. And as we did this work, as I said, started years ago, so we didn't know how bad things were going to get. But those of us who came together on this commission, about 36 of us, all had in one way or another a sense of there being a warning sign that things were really broken. As I mentioned, mine was that 2013, 9% approval rating for Congress, but everybody had their own early warning alert sign saying this is a moment to stop and to figure out how to get our constitutional democracy back on track. And we spent about 1.5 years running listening sessions all over the country, trying to listen and hear. And the story we heard is really actually the story I've been narrating to you tonight, that everywhere people would convey an experience of seeing our political institutions as non-responsive, of feeling disempowered by them, and as seeing that they didn't necessarily feel that they had an equal vote. Sometimes it was a matter of campaign finance and the sort of vast expenditures by corporations as being what made people feel unequal. Sometimes it was the sort of differential weighting between a vote in California and a vote in Wyoming when it comes to an impact on, for example, a presidential election. So there were different specific sources behind those experiences, but those are what we heard. And we heard a story of a sort of vicious cycle in our national life in which, because our institutions leave people feeling disempowered and they're non-responsive and don't actually provide equal representation. People withdraw from participation. And when they withdraw from participation, they actually then are not joiners. They don't participate in the other organizations of civil society that pull people into the political process. And when that happens, then there's less exposure to people who are different from you, have different views, and we become distant and alienated from each other. In fact, levels of distrust that Americans have for one another have increased. It's not just that our distrust for our government has increased. We also just don't trust each other as much any longer as we did. And then those two things connect as well to a general erosion of a culture of mutual commitment to each other and to constitutional democracy. So you get a vicious cycle. And therefore, in the report that we worked on that put out this summer with 31 recommendations for what we can do about our democracy, its first key contribution is a conceptual one. It's the idea that our job is to flip the switch from that vicious cycle to a virtuous circle in which we reform our institutions. We make important changes so that they are responsive, they do empower people, they do deliver equal representation. And we have to invest in our civil society organizations so that they help people bridge difference. And at the same time, we actually have to work on cultivating a culture that does nourish, give us reasons to feel mutually committed to each other and to our constitutional democracy. So we need a virtuous circle linking healthy institutions, a civil society that helps us bridge, and then a culture that restores solidarity, in effect, so that we can rebuild the bonds among us that make it possible to make good and healthy decisions for all of us together when we face a crisis like the pandemic or ongoing crises like income inequality and issues of racial justice. So that's the conceptual goal, that in order to fix our democracy, there's not a silver bullet. There's not one thing you can do. You've got to work on institutions, on civil society, and on culture simultaneously. But having said that, I'm just in conclusion going to share a few concrete institutional recommendations that I think would be particularly valuable. So we recommend increasing the size of the House, increasing the size of Congress. Congress was capped in its growth in the early 20s on the basis of a fight over the census, but it was supposed to always grow with the population. And in that regard, this is an important event, the capping, because that capping of Congress resulted in exactly the sort of imbalancing of the Electoral College that we've all been witnessing the effects of. So because Congress, or rather the Electoral College, is constituted out of a combination of the number of seats in Congress and the Senate, if Congress grows, then we rebalance the Electoral College and get back to a place where the relative weighting of highly populous or densely populated places and less populous places gives us a reasonable mechanism for decision making. Right now, we're in a situation where it's just too probable that you'll have a discrepancy between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. It's okay if that's a rare probability event, but it's not okay if it's a high probability event. When you're in that situation, you're eroding the fundamental legitimacy of your electoral system. But increasing the size of the House would address that issue of the Electoral College, as well as making Congress more responsive by getting folks back to having a sort of smaller constituency size. Now, it's important to know that both the British Parliament and the German legislature are bigger than our Congress. So it is indeed possible to be bigger and be functional. Now, the other recommendation that I want to call to your attention is a proposal that we shift to universal voting, that we treat voting in the same way that we treat jury duty, that there should be voter duty and jury duty. The model here is Australia. In Australia, where voting has been mandatory for a century, there's a very minor fine. And to say that voting is mandatory does not, in fact, mean that you have to fill out your ballot. You can show up and participate and submit an empty ballot. So it's still possible to have your vote be none of the above. I'm not interested in putting anything in here. But nonetheless, there's an ethos of a duty to participate, and that ethos is reinforced structurally. This is a valuable change for a number of reasons. The first, and in some sense smaller one, is that when voting is mandatory, candidates don't have an incentive to campaign with the goal of demoralizing their opponents' voters so that those voters won't turn out. So right now, our elections are full of negative campaigning, partly because one of the purposes of those negative ads is just to try to keep your opponent's voters from even wanting to bother going to the polls. They just will feel so terrible about their candidate that they're not going to turn out. That incentive to campaign negatively in that way falls away when you have universal voting. But here's the more important point about universal voting. I mentioned in narrating the COVID story that we are having this fundamental fight again about voting rights in this country and about whether or not we really are committed to universal suffrage. And whereas such a commitment, in fact, means not only do we on paper say that there's universal suffrage, but we actually achieve access to the vote for everybody, make it easy to vote, ensure that people have vote centers within close range, that the time bands are available for people to vote, and so forth. Now, universal voting hopscotches over all the fights we're having over voter suppression. It once and for all asserts that our commitment is to universal suffrage, and the only question we need to work on is a technical one of just how to execute everybody's participation. So with jury duty, for example, we don't have a fight over who's going to participate or not. At this point, we have made that universal, but now what we do is just work on making sure everybody fulfills their duty. And that is, I believe, the situation we should have with voting as well. So universal voting would put to an end the fight that is the bitterest, deepest, most profoundly important in our country right now, and that is whether or not we will maintain our commitment to universal suffrage, right? So as we think about that insurrection on January 6th, I want you to see all that dry tinder flowing from disempowerment, and therefore to encourage you to think about how we can achieve modes of governance that are both effective and not top down, but actually empowering of people, so not paternalistic. So we need a combination of effectiveness and empowerment in our governance. And I believe a foundation for achieving this is to protect the commitment to universal suffrage by adopting universal voting and putting to an end the fight we're currently having around voting rights, so that we can get back then to the job of governing in effective and empowering ways on behalf of everybody. Thank you so much. I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Professor Allen, so much for coming home to California. I'm delighted to learn that your mother is among the hundreds and hundreds of people who are listening to us this evening. And I want to welcome everyone who has tuned in from their home, wherever they are this afternoon or evening, to the dialogue portion of the program. What we're going to do is spend a little time talking about all of these great ideas, and we'll have a short conversation to kick things off, and then we have so many questions that have been sent in prior to the lecture and that have come in during the lecture. And so the other folks who you heard from at the beginning of the program have been hard at work going through those, and I am going to do my best to keep an eye on what they've pulled out, and I will ask you some of those. But I want to start just by thinking about this concept that you've asked us to think about, the civic health of the country. And you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And you mentioned trust in Congress. And I thought we could maybe blow that out a little bit bigger to trust in government in general. And as you know, that has been on the decline for decades and decades. This is a long-term trend that goes back to Vietnam and Watergate. And that's sort of the beginning of this period where Americans started to say, wow, we don't really trust the government. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether you think that long-term trend suggests something about people, that ultimately the shine was going to come off government a little bit, this was going to happen, whether that's just, is it about the times? Things are much more complicated now, and so government can't really solve problems and empower people in the same way as it could. Or is it really tied to this particular moment in time? Is it a branding problem? Or is this something much more complicated about the long sweep of history and just citizenship? Maybe we start there.
Sure. Well, I think one of the important data points about trust, just to start from that very concrete level, is that while levels of trust for the federal government have fallen steadily since the 1970s, Americans do continue to trust local government. So about 70% of Americans will say they trust local government. I think that's a very telling detail. I think if you pay attention to the different ways in which local and federal government operate, you'll see exactly actually some of the issues I'm talking about. That is, it's much easier, obviously, for local governments to be obviously responsive to their constituents, for elected officials to know the members of their community, and for the members of the community to feel that direct responsiveness. So there is a problem of scale and distance for starters, but that's certainly not the whole of the story. I think it's also notable that if you look at electoral results over the last period of years, there's a real sort of discrepancy between what shows up in our ballot propositions and what shows up in our national federal electoral results. So if you look at ballot propositions, you actually see a picture of a society that, surprisingly enough, kind of agrees on the things we should be working on, what the priorities should be. So take marijuana legalization, for instance. There are 15 states that have passed that now. And when it passes, it quite often passes with a supermajority vote. So we're not kind of tangled in knots of polarization on a subject like that. Or even take an issue like the restoration of rights to convicted felons. In Florida, that was passed again by a supermajority. So Republicans voting for that as well as Democrats. And campaign finance ballot propositions, those are another one. The one here in Massachusetts in 2018 took more than 70% of voters with it. So we have this paradox that if you look at ballot propositions, you get a clear picture of the agenda that we, the people, in a supermajority way would like to see move forward. But then if you look at our electoral results, we look like we're just at each other's throats. So for me, I think that that really points to a need to redesign key electoral mechanisms and redesign the functioning of our federal institutions. So I don't think it's just a matter of the sort of shine of government coming off. I think some of the kind of fundamentals of how you design an effective constitutional democracy that empowers people need to be addressed again, and that we have, a project, in some sense, as significant in its magnitude as the Project of 1789 on the table for us right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go now to a question from one of our listeners, and this one comes from the Berggruen Institute Executive Vice President and Director of the Future of Democracy Program. And she writes, bear with me while I read the question. We need to draw a distinction between the insurrectionists who want to tear down all institutions and replace them with freedom, she has in quotes, which means to be, oh geez, you can't send me things while I'm reading. Okay, sorry about that. Let's see, let me just go back up. Freedom in quotes, which means to be free from regulation and government, whatever they believe that to be. And those who recognize we need to reinvent our institutions to adapt to the time we are living in and the society we have become. It is clear that our 200-year-old institutions are failing to manage the challenges of the 21st century. The impulse to wash away the old is not wrong. Our institutions are crumbling under the corrosive pressures of technology, globalization, climate change, and disentanglement of identity from geography. But we need to renew and reinvent. How do we immobilize those who want anarchy and empower those who intend to reinvent and replace our outdated institutions with those that are resilient in the face of challenges of the 21st century?
So there's a lot packed in that question. And I mean, I think there are a few different things I would love to say about that. I mean, so the first is that there are a number of different kinds of extreme positions where one has to do the work of trying to, more or less shrink the number of people who adhere to them. You won't ever sort of get rid of them completely, but you can do the work of shrinking the number of people who adhere to them. And so, I mean, the most obvious of such a thing, of course, is sort of white supremacist point of view, which is morally out of bounds for our society. And so the job really, I think, is to nourish the roots of our society through effective governance in ways that reduce the temptation into problematic ideologies of that kind. Now, I wouldn't put the strong libertarian view that was described in the question in the same bucket. There, I actually think that there's a lot more malleability and flexibility than may have been suggested in the question. So there has been a strong sort of market absolutism operating in our country and politics for the last few decades. But my read of our political and cultural landscape is that even proponents of that strong market absolutism are beginning to see its failings and are ready for an alternative. So I actually see an opening for building out a pretty broad consensus, including in libertarian and sort of right-leaning domains, about the need for that institutional invention that the question is describing.
Excellent, thank you. We will go now to another question. This one from the LA Deputy Mayor. And that question says, how do you deal with the fundamental challenge that anything that empowers more people, like increasing the size of the House, disempowers Republicans and thus can't happen in this climate? So she there is talking about this, I think, innate sense that people have to be, this is for my team or not my team, and that in-group, out-group, or us versus that. How do we get past that?
Well, so there are a few things. I mean, so the commission report that I mentioned, again, it's called Our Common Purpose. If you Google Our Common Purpose, it should come up pretty quickly, was the work of a group that was diverse in all kinds of ways, geographically, demographically, professionally, and also ideologically. And we worked really hard to find a set of recommendations that would be impactful, beneficial to our democracy, that also did secure support from across the ideological spectrum. And increasing the size of the House was one of those, in fact. So I don't think we should actually on that one presume up front that it was, that it's a no-go. And indeed, actually, if you just do the math of what an increase would mean, it's not actually clear, honestly, which party would benefit from that particular change. So in that regard, there is an opening to achieve it precisely because of that. It's actually up for grabs. The other thing I think that is complicated about our politics is that, in some sense, what the question asked about the Republican Party sort of is true if the Republican Party kind of wants to sort of stay on a path of self-destruction. That is entirely possible that the party will do that. However, if it is genuinely interested in competitiveness, what it would in fact do would be start reconceiving itself to fight for the big pool of votes that would be available. And I would imagine that eventually that dynamic would start to pertain. So I think that is one challenge in this conversation, is there is a sort of practice, we've all developed a practice of assuming that maximal electoral participation is good for the Democrats. That's a sort of erroneous assumption. We shouldn't make that assumption, and that's not the motivation for wanting full empowerment of people. The motivation is a human one, because empowerment is a human good, and that should be the fundamental of our commitment to that principle of universal suffrage.
Have you found allies in the Republican Party as you've talked about these messages? And if so, you don't have to tell us who they are if you don't want to, but are they at local levels, state levels? Are there federal level Republican allies?
So again, just referring very specifically to the report from the Academy, yes, we have done work of sharing it with offices in both parties, in both the House and the Senate. And I do think that there is a live conversation. It's very hard to predict how these things unfold. But I do think that there's some reason to think that we can see movement. HR 1 does have significant improvements in it without any question. And we can expect that to move forward. And even if that moves forward with simply sort of passing on majority votes, I think that would be a good thing. I mean, just straight 51-50 or whatever, 51-49 party line votes, I think that would be a good thing for us.
We're going to move now into what I'm going to call a slow lightning round. There are lots and lots of questions about specific kinds of reforms that people would like to hear you talk about. And we have just about 10 minutes or so left in the program. And so maybe I'll throw out some things and you can react to them. And I will tell you, there are about 5 or 6 of them. So you can think about it. And one of them that has come up in the Q&A is the regulation of social media. Is social media civic media? And can Congress come in and regulate that? Or what's the solution there?
Okay, so
Do you want to hear them all? Do you want to hear them all?
Oh, I wasn't sure which way you were
Yeah.
doing. Okay, that's fine. But so the point is that you want short answers from me.
Well, I'm just saying there are,
communicating to me.
let me tell you what
Well,
they
that's
all
fine.
are. And
Okay.
then we can take them in order, but you can know what they are. And then the other things are ranked voting, the Electoral College,
Mhm.
the expansion of Congress, which you did mention, the filibuster.
Mhm.
And
All
so
right.
those are the things people would love to hear you talk about.
Filibuster should go so that the Senate
Okay.
can legislate again.
They don't
Okay.
have to be that short. The answers don't have to be that short.
So that's Electoral College. I believe we addressed by increasing the size of the House. I do not think we should get rid of the Electoral College. I think it matters, in fact, that less populous places have some protection in our electoral system. It's a minority protecting mechanism. The weighting has gotten to be too strong on behalf of those less populous places, but some weighting, some kind of protection is a valuable thing. We can achieve that rebalancing by increasing the size of the House. Increasing the size of the House, challenges there are, basically in our report, I think we recommend going up to 500 because that's basically as big as you can probably get on the existing physical plant. So if you go beyond that, you're having to think about different ways of operating or different spaces, and it does get to be more complicated. Ethan, whom I mentioned, does want us to get back to the original ratio, which would mean a house of the size of 11,000. So just to give you an idea of the sort of spectrum of conversation that's possible here, which would presumably mean a fully digital kind of operation.
The New
Anyway,
Hampshire model.
Exactly. I'm not advocating that. I'm in the 500 members of Congress camp on that particular one. Ranked choice voting, thumbs up. Definitely, we should go for it. Lots of value it brings to our election, in particular by ensuring that when candidates are elected, they come with, whether it's out of a primary or out of a general, more than 50% of the vote behind them. And therefore are people who have been able to build coalitions and are pulling our conversations back toward a problem solving kind of centering way and politics. And then social media and regulation. Yes, it is time for us to come to grips with our social media problem. I think of social media as a sort of city without any street signs or road markings or anything like that. And as a result, like the traffic is just like crashing into itself like crazy, and poor kids are exposed to predatory behaviors and so forth, because who can tell when you're in a dangerous place or a safe place and so on. So it's just time for us to recognize it in the same way that we regulate the design of our cities, we can regulate the design of our social media platforms.
That was a super lightning answer round. We have time now to talk a little bit more, given how efficient you were there. One of the things that I am really compelled by that you talk and write about is this idea of deep listening and understanding, personal understanding, trying to understand other people as they understand themselves. And there's a lot of work that can be done in the civic space, sort of encouraging that in schools and educational spaces. But here's where I get stuck, and I wonder if you could talk about this. If we accomplish that and we have this mutual respect for the set of feasible outcomes, what do we do when we get to the point where we have to write policy and someone's side is going to win and someone's side is going to lose? Someone has to write down who's allowed to get married and who's allowed to use which restrooms. How do we help people push that sense of deep understanding through once there's a winning and a losing side?
No, thank you. That's one of the most important questions there is. And I think that is one of the hardest questions. After the voting rights issue, I would say this is probably the second hardest question that we're currently addressing, particularly around issues of sexuality, sexual identity, gender identity, and the like. And I do think that it is important that we recognize the rights framework that we've established and the need to enforce and protect that rights framework. And then I think there is a really hard conversation about when and where are there various kinds of cultural accommodations We have made accommodations in the past. For example, you think about the sort of experience of the Amish within the broader context of US society. The challenge is, of course, that you cannot permit accommodations that would have a sort of systemic effect of undermining the rights protections themselves. So I think we have not, really gotten to a place where we're engaging the conversation in a productive way. But it does seem to me that there has to be sort of, in some sense, in the first instance, deep listening and work around why the complete and comprehensive protection of rights just in general is so important and what those commitments mean. And then a sort of related conversation around the question of, okay, so there are cultural worldviews, cultural contexts, in which people are thinking about how they want to raise their kids, what they want their kids to focus on as a way of sort of crafting their own identities and things like that. And that's where our tensions are coming in. So then I think we have to have a conversation about, well, what are the possibilities for accommodation? And again, what kinds of accommodations avoid the erosion of the rights that we need to protect? I don't think we've kind of proactively asked that question. That is, accommodations have been proposed from those who are trying to protect the cultural positions that feel threatened by rights enforcement. And those kinds of accommodations that are put forward are problematic because they tend to erode rights. So I think it's sort of time to turn the question around and say, okay, well, we're not going to not protect rights. Those are going to be protected. Given that, let's see if we can be creative about other spaces of accommodation.
Is accommodation another word for compromise?
No, I don't think it is. Not if
Okay.
you are being quite insistent on universal enforcement of basic rights.
And what about when people say, the example that I think I see most often in observing these conversations is rights versus sort of religious beliefs, or as you're saying, my desire to raise a family or live in a community that I think is the kind I want to be in. And religion is also often holded up as a right. And so it feels like a clash of rights.
Yep.
And how do we get past that?
Right. Well, again, I mean, I'm going to point to the case of the Amish. Okay. And so this is our challenge right now, is that we were able to resolve the issues around schooling, for example, for Amish children, partly because the Amish community is small in scale, right? And so we're now exploring a similar sort of set of tensions between rights protections and public requirements and cultural commitments that are anchored in religious communities, the experiences of religious communities and commitments to religious liberty. And so it's the difference in scale, I think, at the moment that makes this much harder. But I wonder, I mean, it's a question, it's a sort of proposal of a potential path to creativity. One hopes that if we take the example of the Amish, or even think about the sort of complicated ways in which Mormon people have made communities for themselves that are not exactly fully aligned, for example, say with mainstream US culture. They're sort of adjacencies, and we build cultural blocks in our society and have had to work our way through accommodations. I think to some extent, the degree to which things can be localized and sort of treated on smaller scales, the more likely we're going to be able to find solutions. That's my hunch, my hypothesis, but I think huge amounts of hard, complicated work to do in working that through.
Does that end up feeling more like pluralism, or is there a risk that it feels like isolation, do you think?
I mean, the goal is deep pluralism, right? All organized around a fundamental protection of basic rights that's consistent and comprehensive across the whole.
Yeah. Let's wrap up with a question a little UCLA specific. So this is also coming to us from our listeners. How can universities like UCLA prioritize building solidarity, institutions of equity, and a diverse and welcoming culture? So what can we do to help make it better?
So Martin Luther King, in one of his, I think it's sort of posthumous essay, said, federal policies are important and enforcement of those policies are important, but they can only do so much. And actually, the work that we have to do is to, across all the institutions of civil society, create world in which people are working together on an egalitarian footing. So I do think that every organization, including UCLA, has a job to do of building practices that are genuinely egalitarian. I mean, so from the small, minute level of, take practices of deep listening into meetings, into classrooms. I, in my own work, try to cultivate in my community is a sort of practice of having people repeat back to each other what they think they've just heard, so that a person can affirm, yes, that is what I said, that is what I meant, before the person then responds to the comment. So there, small things like that can help change the culture of a place, but also it means paying attention to decision-making structures. To what degree are decision-making structures built with a kind of co-design principle, such that the people who are impacted by the decision are actually participating in the design of the thing being decided. So I honestly think from sort of root to branch, we could do work on our civil society organizations to achieve a much higher level of democracy and inclusion and empowerment and sense of connectedness.
I like the idea of getting people to practice the hard things like listening and respecting one another. Those seem like great prescriptions. Thank you so much for all of those ideas. And we've sadly come to the end of our time together, but I want to thank everyone who logged in from home and invite you to come back in May for our next Possible Worlds lecture. It will be digital again, and that will be the Pritzker Prize winning architect, Alejandro Aravena. So watch for a date on that in May. Thank you to the Berggruen Institute for being UCLA's partner in the Possible Worlds project. But mostly, Danielle, thank you to you for not just coming here tonight, but for thinking so hard about these really important questions and caring so much about them and trying to move things forward to a better place. There is nobody who I feel better about leaving that job to than you. So thank you so much.
A pleasure.
And,
it was good to talk with you.
Good job, Mom. And everyone, thanks for coming. Have a good night.